Como é que você quer? Você senta aqui, eu sento numa ponta, o Sérgio na outra, e ele aqui no meio?
É, pode ser.
É isso, né? Vai pra lá. Vai pra cá.
Ah, você vai.
Rita, ich habe sogar einige Slides, aber weil ich denke, das ist ein bisschen schematischer zu zeigen, das ist nicht schlecht.
Ja,
aber das kann man dir dann zeigen. Ne?
Das ist ja irgendwie angeschlossen hier, glaube ich. Insofern
Ja, kann man es probieren. So, dann nehmen wir die Mitte.
Hola. Hi. Good evening, everybody. And welcome to the first lecture of this semester's lecture series of the Department of Political Science of the postgraduate program. I would just like to say a few introductory words and welcome our guests tonight here. So my name is Britta or Brigitte Weifen. For those of you who do not know me yet, I'm a visiting professor here at the department, holding the so-called Martius Chair for German and European Studies, Cátedra Martius de Estudos Europeus e Alemães. which is a visiting position that is supported by the German Academic Exchange Service, DAD. Acho que a maioria fala isso, né, aqui. The march is chaired together with the German embassy in Brasilia, who is organizing already since last year a series of activities called the German Brazilian or the European Brazilian Democracy Forum, right? So we are in this case, we are organizing these events together involving Jan-Werner Müller, who is sitting to my left. Looking at questions of current relevance, I think, the question of populism, challenges to democracy that are a topic not only in Brazil, but also across the world, in Europe, in the United States, and many other countries, even when we look to Asia, the Philippines, for instance, Turkey. So there are many cases where it is being questioned whether democracy is under threat or whether democracy is even dying. And the phenomenon of populism plays a big role there, I think, as potential threat to democracy. So tonight we are going to look at the phenomenon of populism, so asking the question, what is populism? And this brings me to introduce our main speaker tonight, who is Jan-Werner Müller from Princeton University. He's a professor of political theory at Princeton University. He studied political science at the Freie Universität Berlin, University College London, University of Oxford, and also Princeton University, and held various visiting positions at universities and research centers, both in Europe and the United States. And he has published a number of books on political theory, the history of ideas, and questions related to democracy. And to name just the three most recent ones that are available in English, Constitutional Patriotism, another book called Contesting Democracy, Political Ideas in 20th Century Europe. And then the one, this is probably, I guess, going to form the basis for the talk today, is the most recent book called What is Populism? All of them also published in German and in English, and also in some cases translated to other languages, I think. Yeah, so we'll have today a format that differs a bit from the usual Seminario da Pós-Graduação, because I also invited two discussants, particularly also to make the link between the topic of populism on a more abstract general level and to create the link to the situation in Brazil today. And therefore I invited Maria Hermínia Tavares de Almeida to my right, professor of political science, both here at the Department of Political Science and also at the Institute of International Relations, and also affiliated with SEBRAPI. And we have Sergio Costa. He's a sociologist from Freie Universität Berlin, visiting right now as he's part of the Merian Center on conviviality, where the University of Sao Paulo is one of the partners, and Freie Universität Berlin is another partner. So that's why he's mainly here, and I seized the opportunity also to bring him to this round of distinguished scholars tonight. So without further ado, I'd hand over to Jan to his talk, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Thank you, Britta, for the very kind introduction. Thanks to the university and also to the German embassy for bringing me here. I'm honored and delighted to be here, but I don't really like this sort of Politburo style feeling of being up here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to come a little bit closer to you and start off by saying that you would probably all agree that the word populism has become ubiquitous in basically global political discourse. All kinds of actors on the right, but to be sure also on the left, are nowadays labeled as populists. There are even some not obvious candidates for that label. Some of you may remember that even poor Emmanuel Macron, during the French presidential campaign 2017, at one point was called a populist. The accusation was that he was a populist of the extreme center. Whatever the hell that exactly was supposed to mean. Moreover, I'm not telling you anything new if I point out that the media today is dominated by one particular image, or if you like, metaphor, that allegedly explains the key political dynamics of our era. I'm talking about the image of the allegedly unstoppable populist wave, or as Nigel Farage, the former leader of the UK Independence Party, for whom apparently the image of the wave held insufficient world historical significance, put it, a tsunami of populism, which now, to remain faithful to the metaphor, was going to wash away the elites and the establishments everywhere. I actually find this a profoundly misleading image, and towards the end of my brief remarks tonight, I will try to explain why I think it's so misleading. But before getting there, allow me to offer you basically 3 brief chapters on the issue of populism. First, what is it anyway? Secondly, an answer to the question whether populists can actually govern. There are plenty of observers out there who think that almost by definition they actually cannot govern. And then thirdly, the, if you like, all-important question of what is to be done? What can we maybe do against populists in our political world today? So the first chapter, what is populism anyway? Well, if you read, again, the media, of course, the absolutely conventional wisdom of our time is that populists are those who criticize, are angry about the elites, the establishment. When you think about it, it's actually in many ways a very curious, strange kind of thought. I think up until recently, any old civics teacher or civics textbook would have said that being critical with the powerful, be it in politics, be it in the economy, be it in culture, or God forbid even at universities, was actually a sign of good democratic engagement and was not obviously a danger for democracy. And all of a sudden, beginning of the 21st century, we're told virtually day and night by worried observers that this kind of criticism of elites might be the real danger for democracy today. Clearly, it cannot be as simple as that. To be sure, when populists are in opposition, they criticize governments and usually also other parties. But above all, they also do something else. They claim that they, and only they, represent what populists often refer to as the real people, or also very typically, the silent majority. Now, at first sight, that might not sound so dangerous. That's not obviously the same as, let's say, racism, or in the European context, some fanatical hatred of European integration. And yet, this claiming of a kind of monopoly of representing the allegedly real people always has 2 pernicious consequences for democracy. First, and perhaps rather obviously, populists will then also say that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. And this, I hasten to add, is never just a matter of disagreeing about policy or even about values, which after all in a democracy is completely normal and ideally even productive. No, in a certain way populists always immediately make it entirely personal and entirely moral. The issue is always from the get-go that the other characters are simply corrupt or, as a famous politician of our day put it, crooked. So far, so maybe obvious. The second consequence is maybe less self-evident. Populists are also going to say that all those citizens, all those, if you like, among the people themselves, who do not share their ultimately symbolic conception of the allegedly real people, and who logically, therefore, also don't support the populists politically, that with all those citizens, you can put into doubt, you can question whether they actually really belong to the people at all. Let me try to illustrate this perhaps less obvious point with two recent examples. Many of you will remember the historic night of Brexit, at the end of which Nigel Farage, former leader of the UK Independence Party, declared that the outcome of the vote had been what Farage called a victory for real people. Implying, of course, that the 48% of Brits who wanted to stay inside the European Union, well, on some level, aren't quite real, do not properly belong to the British, or maybe in the case of Farage, specifically, the incessantly talk about unification. But notice that it's always unification on their terms. And if you are not willing to share those terms, then again, in one form or another, you're out, you're excluded, you're not properly part of the people. If I may, let me draw out one implication of this account. If you find anything worthwhile in the kind of conceptual offering I've tried to make to you this evening so far, you might have thought, well, wait a minute, what about populists who lose elections or who don't gain an overwhelming majority at the polls? Don't they have a massive problem? If on the one hand they say, we and only we represent the people, and yet at the same time, we can't even win an election. Yes, it is a massive problem for populists, and I think it's not an accident that very often, I'm not saying always, but very often, they respond to an election loss with a very particular strategy. What they very often tend to do is to basically say, by definition, if the silent majority hadn't remained silent, we would always already be in power. So let's maybe take another look at that majority. And perhaps what we find from the populist point of view is that we're not really dealing with a silent majority, but a silenced majority. In other words, there is a suggestion that somebody behind the scenes, of course usually the old elites, must have manipulated things such that the people could not properly express themselves. If you again think back to 2016, you also remember, of course, how Donald Trump before the election kept telling people, whether I'm going to accept an outcome where Clinton wins, I will tell you at the time. Everybody understood what that really meant. According to some surveys, 70% of Trump supporters said, if Clinton wins, it must have been rigged. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, I think is a bad number for any democracy. It shows that large parts of the citizenry basically don't trust their electoral and perhaps more widely political institutions, and that this very distrust is being fed by populist politicians. I also hasten to add here that, of course, it doesn't follow from this that we can't criticize our electoral institutions, especially, but not only in the United States. There's plenty to criticize, from campaign finance to gerrymandering and plenty of other stuff that we could think of. My point is that there's a difference between somebody who basically makes these criticisms of the system and somebody who essentially ends up saying, our system is rigged because I didn't win. The latter is not a democratic argument to make. And yet that is what very often populist actors tend to do. And against that background, ladies and gentlemen, it's perhaps also already very worrying that already now Trump is starting to try to potentially delegitimate the outcome in 2020 by keeping up the story that many people are voting illegally, there are all kinds of problems, which could then basically, under the circumstances, allow him to say, I'm not really going to recognize an outcome where I'm not the winner. All right, swiftly on to the second chapter I promised you. Can populists actually govern? There's a kind of conventional wisdom out there that says that basically by definition they can't really govern. It's often said, especially by, let's say in the broadest sense, liberal observers, that populists are all about being anti-elitist, but once they're in government, of course they are the elite. So they cannot possibly continue a kind of anti-elitist rhetoric. Or a variation of quasi-liberal views, it's also very often said that it's a characteristic of populism that its proponents have these horrendously simplistic policy ideas. And they make all these unreasonable demagogic promises. Once they get into office, they of course realize that the promises can't be kept. All the policies are failing. So they either abandon the policies and become more moderate, but if they don't, then all their supporters are just going to see that nothing is really working in practice, so they're going to abandon the populists in government. You can probably see that the outcome of all these various views is always the same. Don't worry too much. The problem is going to solve itself once they get into government one way or the other. It's a wonderfully comforting view, and I think it's profoundly mistaken. We have enough examples of populists in power in our era, and Britta mentioned some of them in her introduction, to be able to say that not only can populists, broadly speaking, govern, no, they can govern specifically as populists, which is to say, as anti-pluralists, which is to say, as actors who on a fundamental level do not accept the legitimacy of an opposition. Furthermore, I think we're even in a position nowadays to say that from these various countries, from these various experiences, has emerged something that perhaps rather perversely you could call a populist art of governance, with very specific elements where some of the relevant actors can also learn from each other as to how to implement this art. Allow me to give you a couple of specifics as far as this particular art is concerned. Perhaps the most obvious aspect is that whenever they come to power, populists are going to react to criticism of their rule from independent institutions, be they constitutional courts, be they free media, with the claim, who elected you? Nobody, of course. We are the only elected representatives, and furthermore, we are the only ones who truly represent the real people. Maybe so far so obvious. Less obvious, perhaps, are three other elements of this, you might say, pernicious art of populist governance. For one thing, it seems to me it's not an accident that many of these populist actors, if they have sufficient power, will do nothing less than, if you like, occupy the state itself. By which I mean that they try to replace what, at least in theory, should be a neutral, non-partisan civil service bureaucracy, if you like, with partisan actors. Now, many of you might say, wait a minute, I can think of plenty of parties, plenty of governments who try to do that. There's nothing specifically populist about this. Yes, except that populists are going to do something that many other actors will try to do in as clandestine way as possible, fairly openly, and with what, from their point of view, can appear as a real moral justification. Remember that their core claim is, we and only we represent the people. Who is the state there for? Well, it's there for the people, of course. So if they occupy the state, it's basically the same as the people themselves appropriating what is rightfully theirs, namely the state. Second, I think, very common element of populist governance is what for shorthand you might call mass clientelism. The old idea that governments distribute benefits and bureaucratic favors to those citizens who support them, and ideally nothing else for the rest. Again, many of you will probably say, wait a minute, I can think of plenty of governments and parties who do that. Nothing specifically populist about this. Yes, but it seems to me the difference, one more time, is that many other actors will try to hide this sort of approach. For populists, by contrast, remember, from the get-go, not all citizens are the real people. So if only the people, as in the real people, get benefits, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's actually how things should be. Third and last element, and this will probably not surprise you in the least, if there is protest from civil society against populists in power, populists in power will essentially follow a playbook of pushing back that arguably was first fully worked out by Vladimir Putin. What do I mean? I mean the tendency to react to, let's say, demonstrations out there, civil society mobilization, by saying that what's happening out there is actually not really a matter of citizens voicing dissatisfaction with the government. No, what's really happening is that all these people have been bought, organized, manipulated by outside foreign actors. And then, you can bring out the range of usual suspects. It's been the CIA, George Soros, always a favorite in these contexts. But there are really no limits to creativity. Some of you will remember the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul a couple of years ago. Many citizens coming out against Erdogan's plan to reorganize the center of the city. What did the Turkish government do in response? Basically explained to the world that everything that the naive outsiders and observers had taken to be genuine protest from civil society had, of course, been organized by, obviously, Lufthansa, the German airline. Why? Because Turkish Airlines was going to benefit from the fantastic new airport that Erdogan had also built, and was now going to be very serious competition for the Germans. So that's why they had bought all these people and sent them out to protest. Again, notice a small but surely not insignificant difference between basically normal quote-unquote democratic politicians in how they react to protest and how populists react to protest. Of course, a quote-unquote normal democratic government is also in all likelihood going to say, look, we are elected, we have the mandate to carry out certain policies. Yes, you can protest, but nothing is necessarily going to change until the next election. And that's how it's going to run. That's very different from somebody who, in response to protest, says, or perhaps rather in this case, tweets, that all the people out there protesting against what at the time, and I guess still is known as the Muslim travel ban in the US, are, as Trump tweeted, paid-up activists. It's basically another way of entirely denying the legitimacy of these actors. You don't even get into a debate about justifying policy, why we are right as a government and the protesters are wrong. That entire possible conversation has been cut off with the notion that these are fundamentally illegitimate, bad faith actors. So that was just a very rough sketch of what I take to be the core elements of this populist art of governance, and I hope that perhaps later on we can get into a conversation in which other parts of the world this could possibly apply or not apply. But for now, swiftly on to the last chapter, if you like, of my talk. What is to be done? Well, in a sense, I think by now it's easier to talk about what is not to be done. I think in a sense we have a better sense of what to avoid than any sort of simple magic solution, like in most circumstances in life. So what do I mean? Let me just very briefly talk about what I take to be still very widespread approaches that, broadly speaking, non-populist politicians and parties have opted for in reaction to populists, and say a few words as to why I think they are profoundly misguided, actually on various levels. So one very common approach, especially in multi-party systems, where populists first appear as, self-designated insurgents against the elites. Very typical approach by many other politicians under those circumstances is to basically exclude these insurgents entirely. From the get-go, to say, we're not going to debate these people on television. If they're in parliament, we're not going to answer their questions. We're going to walk out. We're going to make it very clear that we consider these to be, in some cases, racist actors, in some cases, anti-democratic actors, whatever the particular justification might be. I think this is a profoundly misguided approach, both on the level of, if you like, strategy or instrumental reason, if we take that to be about how do we basically defeat these actors, but also on a more, if you like, normative level. On the strategic level, it's profoundly mistaken, because by excluding them, you, of course, entirely validate, entirely confirm the very narrative which populist leaders are always serving their followers. The elites don't care about you. They don't want to talk to you. There are all these taboo subjects that are like immigration, like refugees, that nobody dares to talk about. We're the only ones to dare to address them. And the elites are so afraid that they don't even talk to us. So it's bound to fail on that level. And in fact, it's in all likelihood going to strengthen populist parties. But there are also a variety of problems on a more normative level. For one thing, if you basically exclude politicians who, let's say, are already represented in parliaments, what you effectively end up doing is to deny representation to all those citizens who opted, who voted for these politicians. And we can never presume, although maybe some of my colleagues will disagree about this, I think we can never presume that all those who vote for populist parties are therefore themselves populists in the sense of anti-pluralists. In many cases, we simply don't know. You will all remember how badly it backfired. I mean, there's really no need at this point to, still be beating up on Hillary Clinton, but what the hell? You remember how badly it backfired when she called Trump voters the deplorables. Actually, in many ways, a lot of what Trump said, a lot of what his supporters said was deplorable. What was, in my view, much more problematic about Clinton's view was A, the generalization, as if she knew this about every single person who might be tempted to vote for Trump, but even worse, that she used the word irredeemable. She basically suggested to people that these citizens are lost for democracy, for good. And I think that's, in a sense, an assumption that goes very contrary to the very essence of democracy. Democracy is based on the notion that people change their mind. Of course, very often they don't. But the expectation, the hope has always to be there, that in light of new information, new opinions, people sometimes go this way and sometimes go that way. Very banal, you might say, but absolutely crucial for the whole thing to work. So for somebody to declare certain citizens as basically beyond redemption, to basically say that these people are never going to change, they're never going to change their mind, I think was actually the real scandal. And the deplorable expression was relatively harmless by comparison. Well, if we're not supposed to exclude them, then what? Well, many politicians, of course, have opted for, if you like, the other extreme. After many years of telling citizens that, look, these parties are beyond the pale, they're demagogues, they're scandalous, many politicians all of a sudden switch to the opposite extreme and start saying things like, these populists, maybe they've discovered something about what's really going on deep down in society. People's real anxieties and concerns, they've sort of discovered that, they've kind of brought it out into the open, so we really have to sort of take this much more seriously, respond to them, and in many cases, de facto start to imitate them. So instead of exclusion, we now have a tendency to basically start running after populist parties, a kind of paradoxical sounding strategy of destruction through imitation. Again, I think it's pretty clear that this does not work on the level of strategy, and that it also comes with a string of profound problems at the level of democratic theory. Why doesn't it work at the level of strategy? Well, as plenty of people have found, most recently perhaps Nicolas Sarkozy, when he wanted to come back in the running for the presidency and basically started to run after Marine Le Pen, he found that no matter how fast you run, you're never going to catch these people. Because no matter how many concessions you make in terms of immigration policy, refugee policy, yet another thing that you're going to absolutely have to serve to Muslims in school, and they, damn it, are going to have to eat it. No matter how much you come up with, you're never going to catch them. They're always going to have one other thing, one other demand that they're going to sort of put on the table and that then you might not be able to fulfill. Moreover, again, perhaps rather obviously, many citizens, in response to this strategy of destruction through imitation, are going to say, wait a minute, now all of a sudden these actors are legitimate, so then why don't I vote for the original instead of going for the pale copy, who, as in the case of Sarkozy, may already have been in power and actually never really delivered anyway what they are now promising. So it's bound to fail at the level of strategy. But there's also, I think, a very deep, or actually maybe even two deep problems at the level of democratic theory. One is that this kind of, let's call it bluntly, opportunism of the mainstream, where supposedly established parties start to make concession after concession in trying to be like populists, can sometimes lead to an entire political spectrum shifting in a direction, in this case, in a right-wing direction. That's not in and of itself forbidden, of course. But what plenty of countries have found, think, for instance, in the European context of Denmark and the Netherlands, is that after many, many concessions and after many, many votes where the supporters of mainstream parties were precisely thinking that they're not voting for populists, all of a sudden they realize, look, we've come to a place on questions of immigration, refugees, etc., where actually we don't really want to be. And there's never really been a kind of comprehensive democratic authorization for that profound shift. And yet now it becomes extremely difficult to kind of go back. That's one problem. The other problem, I think, has something to do with what I at least consider to be a deeply misguided understanding of how democratic representation actually works. This idea that populists have discovered something about what's really going on in society, and they basically brought it out into the open. They filled what some political scientists then like to call a gap in representation, where people basically said, look, we have these concerns, nobody is speaking up for us, the populist political entrepreneur comes along, mobilizes these people, gets them to the polls, and then they're represented. This, ladies and gentlemen, strikes me as a basically far too mechanical understanding of how representation actually works. It assumes that people have more or less given interests, but even more or less given identities, and now they're kind of mechanically reproduced in the political system. When in fact, my proposition to you, we should understand democratic representation as a dynamic process, where even people's core interests, even their identities, are often formed in a kind of dialogue with politicians, civil society, friends, and family, where the kinds of, if you like, representational offerings they get play a huge role in how they end up viewing themselves. So what is especially, I think, nowadays on the left, a big temptation to basically behind closed doors to say, well, look, you know, these populists have proven to us that, damn it, workers just don't like foreigners. That's just how it objectively is. And we kind of now have to adapt to that in certain ways because that's a given, relies on this mechanical understanding, instead of what I think should be still advocated and understood as a dynamic understanding. To be sure, eventually, if certain forms of representation persist, certain identities, certain self-perceptions tend to solidify. One brief example, if I may, from the US. Many people in Europe, perhaps many people in Brazil, for all I know, of course, woke up on the 9th of November 2016 and said, oh my God, they elected him. We can't believe it. But especially in Europe, there was sometimes at least a small consolation when, as a next thought, people then said, but you know what? We always knew it. These Americans, they're all racists, right? So at least 63 million of them, went for this guy. This proves what we always kind of knew deep down. And, here we are. But of course, that relies on the idea that every single voter, in a sense, had a fixed identity, which Trump kind of translated into the political system, which at that point certainly was not the case. Certainly at that point, I believe it was also not the case that one could meaningfully speak of a so-called Trumpist movement. Unlike in the old days, the Tea Party, which really had some organizations, whether it was more astroturf or more grassroots, we can debate, but there was something really going on. I don't think there was any genuine movement around Trump in those days. 2 years on, the picture has changed. Many citizens, in a sense, have been continuously addressed as Trumpists, both by those who agree with Trump and those who oppose Trump. So all of a sudden, something has probably solidified around the notion that, yes, I am really a Trumpist. That is kind of my identity. So something that was much more fluid, open, possibly changeable, eventually becomes fixed, partly on the basis of how others act. All right, by now, I'm sure you're all sick and tired of this, we invite these people from the US, they're supposed to say something constructive and positive and uplifting, and this guy just keeps talking about what not to do, what not to do, what not to do. So finally, where is something more positive? Well, in a nutshell, very briefly, if I may. A lot of these issues, I think, have to be debated at the level of policy, which is to say, it's important that other actors don't only think about the strategic quasi-PR level, but really think about what it means to perhaps reconsider a whole range of possible policies that people might have good reasons to be upset about or demand something different. I mean, very banal statement, but far too often that's entirely left out in favor of pure strategic thinking. Perhaps less banal, I think it's crucially important that other politicians, let's call them democratic politicians for the sake of argument, on the one hand make it clear that on plenty of issues we can have an open democratic debate. Immigration, refugees, questions of gender, plenty of stuff that one can disagree about in a democracy. Somebody who, for instance, says, I want zero immigration, I personally would not agree with, but I would be hesitant to say, oh, this is a position that is absolutely not allowed in a democratic context. Having said that, when there are moments in these kinds of debates, when populists then specifically, if you like, reveal themselves as populists, it's very important that other politicians then basically signal this fact and draw a red line. Let me give you one brief example from Germany. It's a real-world example. If somebody says that there's a secret plan by Angela Merkel to replace the German folk with Syrians, it's very important that other participants in this debate don't treat this as, oh, that's another interesting contribution to the debate we're having here. It's very important that from the get-go they draw the red line. Obviously, the person who made this observation, this contribution, is not going to recoil in response and say, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was spinning a conspiracy theory. Thank you for pointing it out. I won't do it again. Of course, that's not going to happen. But it's not about him. It's about an audience of citizens where, crucially, there might be plenty of people who might agree on some of the policy issues, but who nevertheless don't want to be in the same boat with conspiracy theorists, with people who constantly wage culture wars, incite hatred against minorities, etc., etc. Maybe a pious hope, but not entirely without reason. And this brings me to my very last point. I promised you I was going to go back to the image of the wave and the tsunami. What's so misleading about this seemingly obvious image or metaphor? Well, if you think back to how it was often presented, first Brexit happened, then Trump, then possibly Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, then Marine Le Pen in France, and so on and so forth. This kind of basically domino theory, one was going to fall after the other, of course left out the perhaps not entirely insignificant fact that, with all due respect to him as a politician, Nigel Farage didn't really bring about Brexit all by himself. After all, he needed his very established conservative, as in Conservative Party, collaborators who basically told citizens, look, Nigel over there, he's a bit eccentric, but Brexit is a jolly good idea, and we should do it. And here are the reasons for why we, as established, responsible politicians, think it's a jolly good idea. So basically, heavyweight, serious people like Boris Johnson, well, maybe not Boris Johnson, but people like Michael Gove and others who really said there is a kind of intellectual case for Brexit. It's not people that we hear all that much from right now, but they were pretty important in those days. In the United States, at the risk of saying the obvious, Donald Trump did not become president as the leader of a spontaneous grassroots movement of, as the cliche would have it, angry white working class males. No, he was the candidate of a very established party. And it's factually incorrect to pretend that he somehow hijacked the party as if it had been this, ship sailing along and then this pirate, came down with his Trump helicopter or something and took over the steering wheel. Trump also needed heavyweight, no pun intended, collaborators like Chris Christie, Rudy Giuliani, Newt Gingrich, people who speak with authority to conservatives in the United States, who basically told their voters, yes, maybe he's a bit eccentric, he says a couple of funny things from time to time, but he is our candidate, and you can vote for him. And as, again, banal as it might sound, the single most important factor that explains what happened on that fateful day of 8th of November 2016 is simply partisanship. It's the fact that more than 90% of citizens who identify themselves as Republicans in the United States did what most citizens tend to do on election days, which is to go out and vote for their party. And that's all they did. Of course, it's not the entire story. The other part of the story that needs to be added is that, as we know from exit polls, plenty of these people were willing to go on record in saying he is not qualified to be president. And then in the next poll would say, I just voted for him. Something has to explain that seeming schizophrenia. And arguably, what explains it is the fact that for a long time, the Republicans have basically been trying to delegitimize the other side in such a way that plenty of Republican voters did not necessarily like Trump, but had such a strong negative identification vis-à-vis the other side that they basically said, under no circumstances can I vote for a Clinton. Anyway, long story short, all I wanted to make plausible to you is that up until today, nowhere in Western Europe and nowhere in North America has at least a right-wing populist actor come to power without the collaboration, and I use the word collaboration mindful of all its historical resonances, without the collaboration of established conservative elites. And that is important, I believe, because it gets us away from this quasi-naturalistic image of the wave, which by definition is unstoppable. None of us can really stop the wave. And redirect our attention to some of the other actors in this game, and potentially also hold some of these other actors in the game accountable for what they've done when they decided that it was acceptable, or in some of their minds perhaps even necessary, to collaborate with some of these, in this case, far-right populists. So I stop on this happy note and look forward to the comments from you and from my colleagues here.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will just turn over to Maria Herminia.
I'll stay here since I need my notes in order to conform to my 10 minutes. I'm very honored and pleased to be here, and I would like to thank Britta for the invitation. Britta has prodded us to use the 10 minutes we have to speak about how the new Brazilian situation fits in this exciting discussion on populism, which Professor Müller has so vividly offered to us. I will try to do so. But I would like also to use part of my time to make comments regarding what you said and you wrote in your book regarding the concept of populism as it has been presented here. A long time ago, Giovanni Sartori said that the task of political science should be conceptualize, define and analyze and explain political phenomena by political factors or variables. And I think that this is exactly what you, Professor, has done so successful in the discussion of populism. Populism is a political type of leadership, of movement, of political rhetoric, characterized by being anti-pluralist, anti-elitist, and by a claim for moral monopoly of the true representation of the real people. This is a totally different definition of populism from those we have been using since long in Latin America, definitions that used to associate populism or either to actual and symbolic political inclusion of popular masses in the political arena through the recognition of basic labor and social rights and establishment of state corporatist institutions. We can think about Vargas, about Perón in Argentina, about Cárdenas in Mexico. The other way that we have used the concept of populism was to designate a specific type of economic policy. The discussion of the 80s and the 90s on the thing of Jeffrey Sachs said, well, there are some kinds of economic policies to deal with inflation and fiscal imbalances, and that sometimes aggravate inflation and fiscal imbalances. This is economic populism. Here we are discussing in another realm. I think there's a clear gain in having an exclusively political definition of populism. This allows us to think populism, as you proposed, as a permanent shadow of representative politics, as a permanent shadow of democracy. And irrespective of the ideological position of the populist leaders and movements, they can be either from the left or from the right, and of the specific contents of their policies that varies a lot, as you have shown in your presentation. So, populism is a threat to democracy, but it may or may not destroy democratic life. And now I have some questions for you. They may destroy or not democratic life according to some circumstances. Is it possible to think of a situation where populism will be normalized in the sense that it will become a permanent component of contemporary democracies, and populists may win elections or lose elections, and they are there, they talk to a part of a parcel of the citizens. Is it possible to think of this, or populism is always eventually antithetical to democracy and democratic life? If and when populists become government and stay in government long enough to destroy basic democratic institutions, what kind of regime follows and how to conceptualize it? Is there a specific type of democratic crisis ensuing from populist rule, or how can we think the day after the collapse of democratic institution? And here I would like to ask you about the relation between this concept of populism and other forms and other forms of anti-democratic movements and leaders. Actually, Juan Lins has made a similar effort you have done to conceptualize non-democratic movements, leaders, and regimes as pure political phenomena. And he arrived at the distinction between totalitarianism or authoritarianism, etc. Do you see any possibility of a fruit dialogue between the two endeavors, yours and Lins? In what sense? Those are my questions regarding the more conceptual discussion. Regarding Brazil's present situation, I will be very, very brief. I confess I did not yet overcome the perplexity and the awe produced by the 2018 election results. And I think it's too early to assess the meaning of the new situation, or at least to assess completely the meaning and the consequences of the new situation. As for today, I gather there are three current hypotheses about Bolsonaro's government. They are very stylized here, and I will present it as in a very stylized manner. The first states that this is a conservative government that will try to implement liberal economic reforms and conservative values agenda, and it will be constrained by the power of political institutions, the Constitution, the Congress, the judicial system, the veto points embedded in the federal structure of the state. And also, it will be constrained by societal institutions, the media, the organized civil society, the organized interest. There will be no threat to democracy, just normal alternation in power. If you are interested in here the complete development of this idea, I have participated in a debate organized by the Latin American Studies Association at the Facebook, and one of my colleagues actually said that there's nothing happened here. There has been electoral realignment of the voters, and now is the time for conservatives to rule. This is the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis says that this looks pretty much like right-wing populism in power, with an extreme right populist president under military custody, a situation that can eventually not only harm some citizen rights, but destroy democratic institutions. I think this is a perception of several of us at the university. And the third hypothesis says that what we have is a loutish moron president whose inner circles comes from the scum of society, la racaille, as the French would say, and whose lack of basic abilities of thinking and speaking, he cannot say a phrase larger than one that fits in the tweet. And in this sense, this is a president that do not qualify as a populist leader, capable of coordinating the different groups that surround him and have contradictory agendas. Ultra-liberal Democrats, ultra-liberal economists, I would say 19th century social Darwinists more than liberal or classical liberal economists, retired military, evangelical politicians, evangelical in the sense you use here, not the German sense, in the sense of Pentecostal evangelical politicians, anti-globalist lunatics. Under these circumstances, political crisis will be always around the corner, and nobody knows where it can take us. That is to say, this is a vision that says this cannot have a find an equilibrium. This will tend to develop in open classes. In last August, I went to a radio show with a colleague, a political scientist for and we both. Hello? No. Well, last August, I went to a radio show with a colleague, a political scientist, and we both assured the audience that there was a limit to Bolsonaro's growth and that his upper boundary was around 30% of the voters' preferences. Well, he had 56%. Therefore, since then, I refrain from forecasting. And I don't know which of those hypotheses are more possible. I think they are all in our discussion, and I thought that maybe it would be interesting to bring here in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, so
Perhaps you have to change the place in order to present some slides.
Over here?
Actually, it's not usual to have to discuss and present some slides, while the main presenter doesn't have a power presentation, but yeah. Let's see if it works.
It's because you actually know something.
If it works good, my intention is, thank you very much for the invitation, Britta. I'm also very honored to be here. Yeah, you see, some limits. FCS. Because Britta asked us also to present some ideas about the Brazilian case. I think we cannot have more than some ideas. And I'm also very thankful for the fact that Maria Hermina also introduced some very important ideas on the Brazilian case. I will just follow up your comments, although I have actually a fourth hypothesis. And the hypothesis that I have is this: Bolsonaro is actually the expression of redistributive conflict. And I think this is a crucial aspect in the whole discussion on populism, and is an aspect that, according to me, has not been yet really treated very serious. So therefore, my contribution to the debate would be in that sense that I'm trying to introduce the redistributive or the inequality dimension in the discussion on populism, at least in the Brazilian case. So as you know, pink tide is the term coined for describing the somehow progressive governments in Latin America during the first years of the 21st century. And my interest is to understand how could we so rapidly move from pink tide to far right in the case of Brazil. This is especially intriguing if you take into account that pink tide, at least until 2013 in Brazil, produced material improvements for all social strata. Therefore, it's not easy to understand how people decided to vote for Bolsonaro if you had actually a comfortable situation also for the more rich strata and classes in Brazil. So for making my argument, I try to expand the idea of inequality, including at least three different dimensions, and not only the economic dimension. The first dimension is, of course, wealth, encompassing not only income, but also properties, entitlements, and also other forms of economic power. The second dimension is the position of or rank in organizations and hierarchical spaces. This includes both ranks in the labor sphere and positions in social life. And in case of Brazil, spaces of leisure and also of consumption are especially relevant. So use of shopping malls and also use of airports are described as somehow experience of class. And to have exclusivity of using this space is understood in many cases as a kind of class experience. And the third dimension I'll have to take into account is the access to state and legislative power. This relates to formal and informal, legal and illegal means of taking influence over the executive and legislative power in order to receive benefits such as subsidies, good contracts, or legislations and policies formulating for attending private interests. So this is the, let's say, the variables I like to understand what happened in recent years. And for this, I take into account 4 different groups. And my attempt is to understand what happened with these 4 groups since 2003. The first group is the poor. And as you know, between 2003 and 2014, poverty decreased from 30% of the whole population in Brazil to 14% of the population. Since 2015, poverty has increased again, as you probably know. And as you also probably know, Temer's administration adopted policies, and also Bolsonaro electoral program announced measures which directly affect the poor, such as freezing of social expenditure and cuts in work rights. A second group, which is quite relevant, is the group I like to call newcomers. Newcomers are the so-called new middle class. So these are groups, as you know, 40 million of Brazilians moved from the poor, from the position as poor to the position as new middle class between 2003 and 2014. Since then, we have, because of the economic crisis, you have a kind of also decreasing of the economic and also political condition of this group of newcomers. The third group, it's quite important in the whole conflict, so we are also observing, comprehends those who belonged to the middle class in 2003 and did not change their position. Even if the real income of this group did not decrease during pink tide, the established middle class in Brazil experienced some symbolic losses for having newcomers disputing social spaces as universities, airports, and shopping malls, formerly controlled by the established middle class. Also, the expansion of the rights of domestic workers, as you all know, during pink tide, created new difficulties for the established middle class to maintain domestic workers at a regular basis. Since 2015, the established middle classes have faced material losses because of the economic crisis, but the greater loses faced by the newcomers improved their relative position. So they lost, but they didn't lose as the newcomers. So, and finally, we have what I call the Brazilianaires, meaning to refer to, I use the expression to refer the 1% richest Brazilians. They could tremendously expand their economic power during pink tide and controlled today about 30% of the total income and 30% of wealth. In 2015 and in 2016, their access to the state was reduced due to the anti-corruption procedures. Temer's administration using measures such as privatization and debt cuts, recreated new forms of access to power to millionaires. Also Bolsonaro, with measures as, for instance, his announced tax reforms, which reduces taxes for millionaires from moderate 28.5% today to ridiculous 20% of their income, or also other measure, the establishment of a minimum wage under the legal limit, clearly, according to me, intends to transfer resources from the state and from the workers to the Brazilianaires. So this is my inspiration to coin this expression, Brazilianaires. There is a band called Brazilianaires, and there is also a book written by a journalist describing the Brazilianaires from a more, let's say, phenomenological perspective. So, concerning gender and ethno-racial issues, from 2003, 2014, as you also know, important agencies were created, such as the Secretary for Women Policies and the Secretary for Policies for Racial Inequality, as well also as programs were introduced, such as quotas at university for black and poor students, and the program Brasil Quilombola, benefiting the Afro-descendants in rural areas. Also programs and agencies for LGBT population were created, or, for instance, the Coordination for LGBT Rights with the Human Rights Secretary. From 2014 to 2018, we have already in the second administration of Dilma Rousseff some cuts in these programs for blacks and poors. Temer expressed his absolute disinterest for women and blacks' rights through his famous board of white male ministers, as you probably remember. Starting before his electoral campaign, Bolsonaro was also attacked gender and ethno-racial policies as gender ideology. It's a term also used by populists in other regions of the world, and the so-called coitadismo, meaning the victimism of people who are beneficiaries of gender and ethno-racial policies. Also, Bolsonaro's condemnation of the diversity of sexual options speak a clear language with his ministers of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Women and Human Rights, and the Minister of Education. Bolsonaro seems to have elected gender issues in association with the so-called cultural Marxism as the main ideological battle field for his government, a kind of straw man used to turn the attention from the fragilities of his government. So in order to keep my 10 minutes, I'd like to conclude showing how these distributive conflicts were also observed during the elections. So how to explain this abrupt turn from pink tide to far right using an intersectional perspective? According to me, the answer is clear. Votes for Bolsonaro represent a reaction against the minimal change observed in the Brazilian social structure since PT came to power in 2003. The votes given to Haddad and Bolsonaro confirmed this thesis. Support for Bolsonaro, as you see in the table, increases with the income, while in case of Haddad, we have the opposite movement. He won only among the poorest. He also won among women and blacks. So to conclude, I'd like to argue that the impeachment against Rousseff and Bolsonaro's elections and Bolsonaro's election represent clear reactions against Islamist movements in the Brazilian social structure, especially losses of social position by the established middle class during pink tide, and access to the state by Brazilianaires after 2015. I also argue that Bolsonaro's election and his first official actions have created further expectations of a readjustment of the distributive arrangement in favor of capital, Brazilianaires, men, whites, and by chance, the established middle class. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to all our speakers here on the podium. And I would like to open up now to the audience, because there are quite a lot of people here, and I guess there are many of you who have questions. And yes, and I think Karabiki was first. I don't know, I think we passed the mic around. I will move around a little bit here and give you the mic so that you can.
Shall I stand up or? No, actually, probably the microphone is enough. Thank you very much, Professor Müller, for your talk, and it's great to see you again in São Paulo. And thank you, Britta, for putting together this fascinating, distinguished panel. My name is Karabekir Akkoyunlu, a visiting scholar at International Relations Institute here at USP. Professor Müller, I'd like to dare to challenge you on your conceptual framework. I think that if we define populism as essentially anti-pluralistic or anti-pluralist, we would be denying the possibility of, and in fact the existence of, pluralistic populisms. And I'll give you one example. From my own home country, the People's Democracy Party, the HDP, usually billed as pro-Kurdish leftist. The People's Democracy Party was populist in many ways. They used an anti-establishment discourse. They built a clear black and white us and them rhetoric, but they were also clearly positively pluralistic. They emphasized pluralism. Their name was peoples in the plural. And in Turkish, when they talked about us and them, the us, which is difficult to translate, was a plural us. The many we's, the many groups of we. And they were extremely careful to emphasize, actually made it at the center of their political platform to be about inclusion, gender inclusion, political inclusion, religious inclusion, or diversity rather, ethnic, linguistic, cultural. And they focused their attention on what they called the establishment, which is a clique, which is ruling the country, the Erdogan clique. They were also very pluralistic, I mean populist, but they rattled the feathers of Erdogan. In the 2015 election, they doubled with this rhetoric their vote share. Erdogan, for the first time, lost his parliamentary majority, and to regain it, he had to wage war and put the representatives of this very party in prison. So this was an existential threat. And when I think about the possibility of what to do, I cannot overlook this one party, which has been much smaller yet much more effective than all these established centrist parties. And maybe we can expand that example to some other pluralistic populist parties, which are much more inclusive. And when they do come to power, let's say Podemos in Spain, they do not challenge democracy. They do not do that. And maybe even block the way for the rise of right-wing anti-pluralistic populistic parties. So that would be my point. Thank you very much.
You get.
Yeah, sure, try.
Let's take one more question and then we get to defend yourself.
First of all, thank you very much, Jan, for your book and your exciting lecture. My question has to do with the close relationship between the domestic reality within the states and international relations as a whole. And my question focuses on this relationship. And I would pose to you the following question. Do you consider to introduce in your characterization of populism a specific element about international relations in terms of how populists view international organizations? And I explain briefly my question because from your explanation it's possible to deduce, to infer that the rise of populism implies the weakening of international organizations, except the problem of refugees that is evident, except the problem of a claim for more regulatory space in Europe, a claim made by some far-right political parties. Is it possible to say that the populists have a consolidated view about international relations and how do states relate to each other in international organizations?
Okay, now you get to defend yourself.
I only need about 2 hours to answer these simple questions. So, on the first challenge, first of all, maybe at the risk of seeming very pedantic, just a small methodological preface. So I didn't really sort of use the word definition. I may have accidentally talked about essences, which I take back if I did, because in my case, it's not really about sort of here's a kind of static definition. It should more be thought of as a question of, if you like, family resemblances, including even very concretely, if you nowadays, let's say, put Erdogan, Modi, Orban, Kaczynski, Chavez maybe, all sort of next to each other, it would literally be maybe a case of saying, yeah, they're all different, of course, and very different countries, and very different background contexts, and yet, I can see this is one family. I can see they belong together in a way that other actors, would not really belong into this group. Anyway, just the pedantic methodological bit. On the more substantive issue, so where I would take issue with you is that in a sense you took it for granted that the HDP is populist because they have an anti-establishment rhetoric. But of course, from my point of view, I would say, well, that's not enough to sort of say, oh, therefore they must be populist, and therefore, in the eyes of many observers today, they must somehow be a danger to democracy. So I wouldn't even go down the road of saying, well, now that we have a populist party, we find they're actually pluralist, so there must be something wrong with, in a sense, the approach to populism to begin with. But more important even, for me, it's not crucial what the relevant actors say about the people. You can have a super pluralistic, super heterogeneous account of the people. What still also matters is what do you say to people who disagree with you? Do you deny their legitimacy entirely? Do you say that, no, because we disagree, you're out of the game for me, which is again different from the quote-unquote normal politician, who of course also disagrees, but who will recognize the legitimacy of the democratic adversary? Or do you say, no, there is no space here for disagreement in the way that, I mean, it's a very cliched example perhaps, but in a way that, at a certain point, not necessarily from the beginning, with Chavez, it became impossible to really disagree without basically being branded a traitor, an enemy of the people, and so on and so forth. The examples you gave, I think are ones where, yes, there was a very strong anti-establishment rhetoric. In one case, there was even the official claiming of Laclos as, the great theorist of populism. But I don't, at this point, certainly, I don't really see the Podemos leadership denying categorically the legitimacy of the others in a way that, to go back to your country, 2014, Erdogan famously says, we are the people, and then turning to his critics, who are you? And in theory, you could transform this into, we are the super tolerant, super pluralistic, difference is fantastic, let's celebrate diversity people. And then turning to your critics, you say, who are you? You have no standing in this debate. So that's why I think this other factor needs to come in as well. On the question of international relations, which is, I think, a very important issue about which we don't have a lot of research as far as I can tell, and which is, I think, becoming ever more urgent as we see more of these actors in power. My tentative answer would be, I guess threefold. First of all, I don't really see populists necessarily being committed to a highly specific approach in international relations. I think one might be inclined to think that if one equates populism and nationalism. But from my point of view, they remain different concepts. You can be a nationalist who says my country first without at the same time claiming only I represent the people. And you can claim only I represent the people without being committed to some ethno-nationalist agenda. Of course, it's not an accident that in many countries right-wing populism and ethno-nationalism go together. All these actors necessarily need to give an account of who the people are. All of them, I think, will basically make culture war their political business model, so they try to fill the category of the people with something, and nationalism is always, or not always, but it's very often the sort of first best thing that comes to mind. But two other maybe less obvious points. Remember how I was trying to make it plausible to you that just because populists are in government doesn't mean they have to cease being populists. The argument was, well, they become the elite, so they can't keep railing against elites. But of course, no populist in government has ever run out of scapegoats, and especially, as the cliched, possibly always anti-Semitic phrase goes, shadowy international elites. So even if you've defeated everybody more or less domestically, there's always another elite globally, internationally, that then you can sort of point to, also as, of course, the reason why things aren't really working out in some cases as you promise to as you promise to people. Last point, though, it's sometimes said, especially but not only in Europe, that basically a sort of international of nationalists is incoherent. We can't have that. So when you remember, you know, there was this moment when every single newspaper was writing about the fact that now Stephen Bannon had come to Europe, all these, you know, benighted Europeans who didn't really understand how to do populism, these amateurs like Salvini and Orban. Bannon was not going to come and educate them and teach them and so on. And then he was going to form this big movement that was going to overthrow the EU. And people said, but it's actually incoherent because you can't have, you know, these actors cooperating because they're all nationalists. I think at a conceptual level, that's wrong. In a sense, you had an international of liberal nationalists throughout the 19th century. Think of figures like Mazzini and others who said, look, every nation fights its own liberation struggle. We all believe in national self-determination. That's the idea we share. That's also why we can help each other and cooperate. But everybody fights their own thing. And there's nothing inherently contradictory about that. It becomes obviously difficult if every single, let's say, European country is now controlled by somebody who says, my country first, and then we get together and try to negotiate. Obviously, it's going to get tricky at that point. But conceptually, it seems to me there is not a sort of inherent difficulty that, again, lets liberals sleep, you know, better at night because they rest assured that, oh, can't really work anyway, when in fact it might work for quite a long time.
Yes, so that's practical. There are quite a few questions over there. I just take the microphone towards you. I don't know who was first, though. Okay.
So, I was, you said something very interesting that I was rolling around my head a little bit trying to figure out, and I couldn't quite, so I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on it. You made a comment when you were talking about how to combat populism, about democracy. It's essential to democracy that people can change their minds, essentially. What exactly is so essential to democracy about that? And how does that interact with some of the more recent findings we have from political behavior showing that people essentially don't? Or at least it's extremely difficult to make someone change their mind, especially when confronted with misinformation.
So, during your talk, it was clear to me what the difference is between sort of a liberal democracy and a populist regime. It seems that the populist regime still has certain commitment to justify itself to the people. I was just wondering if you have, so how do you distinguish between a populist regime and a sort of dictatorship that holds regular elections? So a one-party democracy that, in other words, how do you distinguish how do you know that Venezuela became a populist regime and then with Maduro it is a dictatorship? Or how do you know, like, they claim to be democracies, but it seems that something changed, that there is a substantial difference?
Hi, my name is Caio Barbosa. I'm a PhD candidate here at the department. Thank you very much, Professor Müller, for your talk. I actually have two questions, if I may, one for Professor Müller, one for Professor Sergio Costa. For Professor Müller, my question, I think many people may ask you that, but in your definition of populism, which I think is very accurate for the times we're living now, but how would you put the similarities and differences from that and fascism? Yes. How would you compare them? And I would like to hear that. And given your definition, would you say that all fascists are populists? And for Professor Sergio Costa, your talk was very interesting for me because I'm actually researching that right now. And it's very interesting. I'm researching that here in the city of São Paulo, and it's exactly like you showed. Like the established middle-class neighborhoods are the ones where Bolsonaro had the highest vote, not the richest neighborhoods. Yes. And I would like to ask you, and we can talk more later about that as well. I mean, why they went away from PT? I think that is clear. But why do you think they fell for this populist break from Bolsonaro? Why did they move away from PSDB and maybe other candidates? And why do you think they went to Bolsonaro? That would be my question. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, my question is actually related to the last question. So I'm a political scientist from the Philippines, so I feel everyone's pain. There's a lot of theories coming out of there now because for those who don't know, President Duterte also used a very strong rhetoric of violence and I'm going to end crime by any means necessary in 3 to 6 months, et cetera, et cetera. And the theories coming out of the political scientists and economists over there attribute it to this new economic growth and the growth of the new middle class, saying that this is a class that is very aspirational and that has things for the first time. So like you have a class of people who for the first time has a cell phone, for the first time has a car or an air conditioner, and if they lose it due to crime or robbery, they can't afford to buy a new one, and that's why they're especially vulnerable to this kind of rhetoric of iron-fisted crime prevention. So I just wanted to hear anyone's reaction on that theory. Thank you.
All right, let's hand back over to our panelists.
Okay, very interesting, i.e. very difficult questions. Let me try to sort of take them in reverse order. Fascism. So what you said I would agree with. From within my framework, yes, all fascists were populists. Clearly Hitler said, I and only I represent the German people, but it doesn't follow that all fascists are populists. For me, and this is obviously contentious, historians have been arguing about this for a very long time, both racism and a systematic cult of violence are indispensable ingredients in fascism. If you don't find that, you might find authoritarianism, you might find, right-wing populism as a regime, all kinds of other stuff, but not fascism as we've historically come to know it. Hence also, as is often said, there's a reason why all fascist regimes eventually go to war, whereas many authoritarian regimes don't necessarily do so. One of the, and this goes also in the direction of the dictatorship question, one of the things that might be worth thinking about when we are nowadays, of course, confronted with a book a week that explains to us that fascism is coming back, we're traveling back to the 20s and 30s, etc., is the obvious fact, prominently pointed out by our colleague David Runciman, that the difference between the 30s and now is that people in the 30s didn't really know the outcome of the 30s, whereas we do. And it's not just us who know the outcome, it's also today's authoritarians and, let's say, populists who know the outcome. Hence, as a further kind of twist in this populist art of governance, I think it's important to understand how some of these regimes, at least, have found ways precisely not to produce images that we would recognize from 20th century dictatorships, while at the same time exerting massive political control. And if we had more time, I think we could go into details in terms of how this might be done, in terms of reducing media pluralism, but not entirely repressing people, so you're still free to blog or, you know, have an obscure newspaper somewhere. It's a question about how you might politicize the domestic economy in such ways that you can exert control without this being obviously traceable, because there's always an economic/neoliberal story as to why you fired this person. It doesn't have to be officially the political story behind it. So I think their repertoire has evolved in certain ways, so much so that, I mean, going back to Turkey, I think, you know, if in a sense you have to become as brutal, as openly brutal as Erdogan, you're not necessarily in a good position. You're much better off as an Orban, as a Kaczynski, who really has massive control over society, but who can still be seen as, oh, it's just sort of very conservative. I mean, it goes along with one of your hypotheses. It's just still sort of within the realm of normal conservatism. Nothing to see here, move on, you know, let's not be so worried about these things. On the dictatorship issue then, and actually together with people changing their mind. So I rely on a I guess, fairly well-known understanding of democracy from another of our colleagues, Adam Przeworski, who famously had, you know, what in the eyes of many people initially seems, you know, a sort of banal definition of democracy, when he famously said, democracy is a system where parties lose elections. And what he was, in a sense, of course, getting at, in his perhaps somewhat more elaborate formulation, was this idea of democracy as a form of institutionalized uncertainty. You don't know in advance what's going to happen. Of course, a lot is predictable. You're totally right that most people don't change their minds. We have very stable patterns in many cases. And yet, it is not total certainty. If you want total certainty, maybe North Korea looks like a great place. So that, I think, remains an essential ingredient in how we have to understand the specificity of democracy. And when we get to a point where basically a real turnover of power is impossible, I think we may also have then clearly shifted from a still more fluid situation where a right-wing populist is in power but has not consolidated really yet, to something that we might not want to call dictatorship, but that de facto is something like a one-party state. And I know that some of you are now going to say, but hey, what about Bavaria? You know, when was the last changeover of power in Bavaria? So we can talk more about, you know, other cases, but that would, broadly speaking, be my answer.
So thank you for both questions rating concerning established middle class. I think this is indeed a key factor for understanding at least what happened in Brazil. I don't know if you can use this kind of categories also to understand the increasing importance of AfD in Germany, for instance. I think there you have other factors. But in case of Brazil, at least according to my hypothesis, the fact that the established middle class supported Bolsonaro is a reaction against losses. Of course, not only material losses, but also symbolic losses, also losses in terms of power. And there you have to combine the aspect of class also with other aspects of intersectional analysis. You have also to put there also gender and ethno-racial issues. And Bolsonaro was perhaps the only candidate who really target these ethno-racial and gender issues in a very offensive way, really producing a discourse against women, against gays, against blacks. The famous discussion on quilombolas is an example for this. So, and then your question, why Bolsonaro and not other conservative candidates who could perhaps also support the established middle class? I think very early was clear that Bolsonaro was the only candidate able to really to win the elections against PT. And therefore, this would be the hypothesis. This is why also established middle class, also people who have, I don't know, a high level of schooling, have cultural capital, they voted for Bolsonaro because they believed that he was the only candidate able for winning the elections against the PT. The other aspect, not yet mentioned, is also in the inequality analysis is described as existential inequality or existential rights. So the right for being protected by the state, for walking the street without being attacked by criminals and so on, is also unequally distributed in society. And Bolsonaro, of course, with the wrong measures, but was a candidate who targeted very much this aspect of existential rights, without using, of course, this vocabulary, but saying, I will protect you against criminals, against certain forms of life which in a certain way are against your own lifestyle. So, and therefore, I think this is the reason why established middle class voted for Bolsonaro, not despite his misogyny, but sometimes because of this, because he was at least in the campaign, extremely racist and also sexist, and this is the reason for which explains how Bolsonaro became a such support by men, by also not only by the established middle class, but by white and men. If you look at the figures, they supported Bolsonaro proportionally, much more than blacks and women.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah. Again, this corner over there. There, okay, one there. Okay. So let's take.
I have two questions. The first one is about both of them are about the features you identify as essential to populism. The first one is about anti-pluralism. I'm not really convinced that this is specific to populism, and if it isn't just like a general framework that several different parties at different times use to present themselves as the representatives of the real people somehow, or the common man, or whatever. But I don't think that's the most interesting point to quibble with. I think that the most interesting point, or at least for me, is that isn't this kind of discourse, anti-pluralist discourse, presenting yourself as the only representative of the people, somehow built in the popular discourse that legitimizes democracy? Like a recent book calls it the folk theory of democracy. Like if you go back to Schumpeter, it calls like the classic doctrine of democracy. You call it the way you want it, but it basically says that in democracy the people as a whole governs, but in practice only the majority chooses who's going to govern. Like and moreover, a electoral majority, not the majority of the population or anything like that. So, given that this is the legitimizing discourse on democracy, isn't it always appealing for for politicians to present themselves as governing in the name of the whole people, so everybody who disagrees with them does not belong to the people. So that would be my first question. And my second question is, I'm sorry. Oh, have you given any thought on the idea that is it possible that populism is anti-elitist in another way, just not like it doesn't just criticizes the elites? Like, I agree with it's something that we expect from every Democrat, but isn't it anti-elitist in the way that it presents the public's most simple-minded views on politics as good enough for implementing policy? So if you think Mexicans steal your job, that's enough for me to, that's your view is good enough for me to build a wall, or say I'm going to build a wall. And in that sense, in appealing to your view of representation as a dynamic process, in that sense, wouldn't populists give up or abandon a role of, let's say, enlightening people's views? Wouldn't that be something that like characterizes them as well? So that would be my second question.
So one more question.
Oh, the honor. Well, good evening. My name is Hermano. I'm a graduate student in global governance, and I have a question for Professor Müller. And my question is, how does populism work at the transnational level? Because we have transnational flows of practices and regulatory frameworks. We have transnational networks of resistance and activism. And do we have transnational networks of populist exchange of practices and experiences? And how does that influence the domestic populist processes of each country?
All right, back to you.
On the first point, I think it's worth picking up this point about anti-pluralism. Not every anti-pluralist is a populist. So Lenin was not particularly pluralist. But unlike populists, he was not justifying what he was doing with a view to the people, saying that, you know, people are a source of wisdom, we are implementing what the people really want, and so on. No. Of course, you need a vanguard party of highly theoretically trained people to tell people what's what, because otherwise all they're ever going to get to is trade union consciousness. Plenty of religious actors, with all due respect, are not particularly pluralist, but they also don't usually have a story about how they represent the people. The people are not, you know, morally virtuous in the way that they are for populists. On the contrary, the people are probably sinful and fallen and in need of redemption. So the anti-pluralism as a sort of free-floating concept is, I would agree, it's not enough. It needs to be combined with a particular story about the people, which gets us to the folk theory. So I'm not quite sure who you were alluding to. If it's basically Chris Aiken and Larry Bartels, I don't think that they're saying really that, okay, the folk theory is that, you know, governments really represent the whole people. What they are, in a sense, trying to not so subtly ridicule is the idea that, okay, citizens turn up, they rationally consider all the policy options, then they make up, you know, their mind about what they really want, and then, you know, a government gets a clear-cut, in a sense, mandate to say this is, you know, what a majority really wanted. And that's where they basically say, no, this is really not how things work at all. But I don't think that the folk theory implies that those who have won an election have to say, basically, if you disagree with us, we somehow deny you legitimacy. People who win elections in the folk theory can simply say, look, you know, you're the minority. As good democratic actors, we recognize that minorities always have to have a chance of becoming a majority. So we act in such ways that, you know, we do what we as winners of this round of the game can do, but we're not, for instance, going to start changing the rules of the game such that the current minority can never come back as a majority. And again, I mean, it might not always be so clear-cut, granted, But I think very often you can identify the fact that populists really talk differently about their adversaries, about losing minorities, about those who they don't deem to be symbolically part of the people, as opposed to normal politicians, who of course also disagree and say, we're right, you're wrong. I mean, that's the banal, normal stuff of democratic politics. But the differences lie in what is said about the other side exactly, what is said about minorities exactly, and so on. Populism as stuff for the simple-minded. No, sorry. I think this is also a long-standing sort of idea that this is, goes a little bit in this Jeffrey Sachs direction. Economists especially, who, after political scientists have spent decades trying to figure something out, economists swoon in and within 5 minutes say, we've got this covered. We have much more data. We do quantitative stuff, like you don't. So we now know what populism is, and we can say that certain economic policies, of course, are so irresponsible and irrational and so on. I'm not saying there's no difference between economic policies and that it's impossible to generate certain distinctions, but I don't find it plausible to basically translate, with all due respect, what very often are simply rehashed prejudices about the great unwashed from 19th century mass psychology into political theory today, and basically always end up blaming the people. As I was trying to make plausible to you, in our recent history, the behavior of elites is much more important. It's not like, there was a grassroots swell to, bring someone like Trump to power. It had much more to do with, as we know from other contributions in political science today, with the gatekeepers making decisions about, who was going to be in the game, who was going to be out of the game, and so on. So I think it's problematic. It's also, maybe if I may add one thought at the risk of stretching everybody's patience at this late hour, I think there's also a distinct danger, which is related but not the same, of basically buying the stories sometimes that populist leaders tell about themselves. So we very often have this notion that, look, they're always, what they say is always simplistic, they're demagogues, they're always lying, it's fake news, and so on. Well, let's be honest. We also like a simple story. So if somebody could explain to us, the cause of populism in 140 characters or less, we would love it. But there's a real danger then far too often one basically says, oh, it's very satisfying if we simply get the explanation delivered by the populist victorists themselves. And more specifically, what a lot of them will try to deliver to us is a story that is about culture much more than about economics. It's become very common to say to people, look, there are all these reactions against elites because elites look down on ordinary people. Elites don't respect the way of life of the West Virginia coal miner, and I'm not sure what in Brazil might be any remotely plausible equivalent, and so on. And that's the explanation. And then, as a result of that, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, lots of liberals are kind of hand-wringing, saying, oh, we have to kind of go on what in the US sometimes is ridiculed as Trump safaris. So you go to Appalachia, you look at the natives, and you kind of try to understand them and so on. And far too often, a much better explanation, which is not to say everything is always reducible to economics, but a far better explanation often is socioeconomic. So yes, you can, for instance, read the Yellow Vest movement in France now as saying, oh, Macron is disrespecting their way of life. But you can also simply say, look, the government did something in terms of price of fuel, not price, but in a sense, inconvenience of commuting for people who live in a certain kind of peripheral France that made their life objectively much more difficult. And there evidently wasn't a lot of thought about that problem. And it has nothing to do with anything specifically cultural. And if you look at the US, yes, maybe plenty of people by now would say, I feel disrespected in certain ways by elites. But if you then push them and say, well, let's have some concrete examples in daily life where there is real disrespect, very often there are not many good examples. But what, of course, has been going on is that for decades, talk radio and a kind of right-wing network of media has been telling people from above day and night that they are being disrespected by, as the cliche then goes, by coastal elites. So I'm not only warning against sort of the dismissal of populist voters. I'm also warning against the tendency to sometimes kind of take the opposite story at face value from populist politicians. Okay, last thing before I, God forbid, entirely slip into lecture mode, which is the last thing you want at this point in the evening. Transnational networks. Yes. Can I prove it to you? No. I think we know far too little at this point about how these kind of exchanges of a certain, let's say, knowledge of governing techniques might really work. Sometimes it seems not crazy conspiracy theorizing to say that when Kaczynski met Orban, a kind of transfer of power as to here is how you trick the EU. Here's how you make, you know, Timmermans and Juncker believe that this is still the rule of law and democracy. Here are the kind of little things you can do with, for instance, selective comparisons in constitutional law, so that for a while you fool everybody about how the whole system works. I think there is probably a lot of that going on. But do we have any sort of real accounts at this point to kind of prove this and trace how that knowledge gets transmitted across borders? I'm not sure. So I'm not sure I really answered the question in that sense, but hopefully what I said was interesting anyway.
Okay, I would like to thank Jan-Werner Müller, Sergio Costa, and Maria Herminia Tavares de Almeida for their participation tonight, and for everybody in the audience who stayed with us until the very end. So thank you for your great insight. Thank you for interesting questions. And yeah, I guess some of us will meet again for the next seminar here at the department, or you, of course, also might show up tomorrow when we'll have another debate on populism and democracy in the center of Sao Paulo at Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, also with Jan-Werner Müller. Thank you very much and good night.
Is there a sense that the established middle class is also on the whole more